I see people are still getting into the waiting room, so I'm just going to wait for 1 minute, not even 1 minute, 10 more seconds. So it looks like we got everybody in. Great. Welcome. My name is Stephen Hyder. I'm the chair of the Department of Economics. I'm so glad you are virtually joining us in East Lansing today. It's a time of the year when walking across campus can test your resolve, but an evening or two at Breslin and Munn can remedy that cold pretty quickly. This afternoon, I'm happy to be hosting our 5th annual alumni webinar. The purpose of this webinar is both to showcase the research of our faculty and to allow you, our alumni, to connect with the department and college. Today's lecture is by Professor Justin Kirkpatrick. Justin received his PhD from Duke University and joined our faculty in 2019. Justin's area of specialty is energy and environmental economics, working on topics such as those that influence the residential adoption of solar panels and heat pumps and the utility company adoption of large-scale batteries. Today, Justin will be giving a talk entitled The Transformation of the Electrical Grid, How Economics Shapes the Largest Machine in the West. He will be discussing how the U.S. electrical grid is undergoing a historic transformation to accommodate alternative forms of electricity generation, each of which has different costs and benefits. Here's the rest of the plan for this afternoon. I'll be turning the reins over to Justin momentarily, who will talk for about 30 minutes. During the talk, please feel free to post any questions that you have in the Q&A. After Justin finishes, I will return and moderate a question and answer session based on the questions that you've posted. With that, I turn the webinar over to Justin Kirkpatrick.
Great, thank you, Stephen. I'm really excited to be here today to share this research and information work I've been doing for some years now with you all. Thank you for sharing your lunchtime with me. The title of this presentation is The Transformation of the Electrical Grid, How Economics Shapes the Largest Machine in the West. And by largest machine in the West, I mean this one. This is the entirety of the generation of the United States for major power plants spread out across the country. And I say largest machine because all of these plants all work in tandem together. They are all connected. Everything from a nuclear power plant on the coast of southern Florida to the Grand Coulee Dam up in the top left corner, the big blue circle in Washington State here. All of these machines work together to provide the electricity that you and I and everyone else doesn't really give a whole lot of thought to. Right? These machines are working, serving us, rarely ever go out. We get very angry when they do. So today what I want to do is take a dive into a discussion on how economics operates this largest machine in the West. Now, the two kind of main economic phenomena that I'm going to talk about as they pertain to the grid today are supply and demand, which I think we're all familiar with thanks to our stellar undergraduate economics education here at MSU. And some of the features of the grid have some unusual properties that don't really match up to most markets as we think of them. And the first of that is the fact that demand for electricity on the grid is entirely inelastic, or almost entirely inelastic. That is, it is not responsive at all to prices. And the second interesting part of demand for the grid, or supply and demand for the grid, is the fact that demand is intermittent or non-constant and sometimes hard to predict.
Justin, your Teams is open.
On that in a second. What was that?
Your Teams is open.
Oh, is that on top? It shouldn't be. Thank you. All right. Okie dokie. The second economic phenomenon we're going to be discussing is negative externalities, right? And that comes in the form of pollutions, unpriced costs of operating the grid, and how that policy kind of interacts with the first and makes for some interesting economic phenomena. First thing we have to do is give a little bit of background on how the grid is operated. So traditionally, our vertically integrated utilities, these are companies like Consumers Energy or DTE, that owned a bunch of power plants, owned a bunch of wires, and had a bunch of retail customers and industrial customers that they'd sold electricity to. So this is kind of how most utilities operated for much of the last 100 years or so. And these are regulated monopolies. So these are companies that have kind of captive retail customers. They get a monopoly over them, and in exchange, regulators get to limit the price increases that they can charge and basically get to review increases in rates. Now, for about half of the country, electricity is actually, the wholesale electricity markets are actually served by independent system operators or regional transmission organizations, ISOs and RTOs, and I'll use those interchangeably. These are organizations like CAISO in California, ERCOT in Texas, MISO in the upper Midwest. And these are firms, they're usually nonprofits, that simply operate a market for electricity. That is, they don't own any generators, they have no retail customers, they send out no electricity bills. But what they do is make the market between the utilities that need to purchase electricity from the generators on the grid, between the utilities and the generation operators, so the firms that own the power plants. And those are often not the same in a lot of electricity markets like California and Texas. And one of the key functions of this ISO and for vertically integrated utilities is that supply must equal demand at all times in all locations down to essentially the microsecond level. And the reason it's important is because if you don't have supply equaling demand, you get an outage. You get a blackout. If you're not familiar, I took a picture of the last one for you here. Right? A blackout is not only inconvenient for customers, our food goes bad, it's cold, the appliances can freeze and pipes can freeze in cold weather. It's also incredibly expensive and difficult to restart generators on a grid from a black start. So avoiding these outages is kind of first and foremost in the operation of the grid. So how do utilities go about doing this? Utilities kind of implicitly and the ISOs explicitly in markets. Well, first they collect supply bids from generators. They say, hey, how much electricity will you provide and at what price? And they do this for every hour of the day, every day for the day ahead. We call it the day ahead market. So they take bids and a generator says, oh, for $40 a megawatt, I will provide you with my full megawatt or 40 megawatts of capacity. And the ISO takes all these bids and kind of stacks them up into what we call a merit order, which looks a little bit like a supply curve you might remember from intermediate micro, and that's exactly what it is. So they make this merit order from lowest to highest, and every generator has an incentive here to bid at their marginal cost because when a market clearing price is realized, everybody gets paid that amount. So in the example here, there are two vertical demand curves. The first one is here at 67 gigawatts, and this is a hypothetical market in 2011, so there's not a lot of renewables down here. At 67 gigawatts, the ISO steps up this curve, gets up to this point, and says, oh, about $40 a megawatt, that's the clearing price. So everybody to the left of that first line gets $40 a megawatt, and demand is served, and everybody's happy. Later that afternoon, on a hot day, the second vertical line you see here, which represents demand, is much higher. Air conditioning is running, fans, people are staying inside and watching movies. So at that level of demand, 114 gigawatts, market clearing price is about $100 a megawatt. So this is a big swing within the day. And that's essentially the market that the ISOs make for us. And all this happens implicitly for the vertically integrated utilities. They stack their generators and decide from there. Now, demand is not constant. We saw that in that example there. On the left here is daily load profile from CAISO, which represents most of California. And a lot of the work I do is in California, so I'll use examples from there. And this is just a day in June of 2022, and you can see it starts out at midnight here. The bit of load declining up to about 3 or 4, maybe 5 in the morning. After that, people start waking up, turning on appliances, cooking, cooling, etc. We see the ramp up in demand, so we need more electricity, a little bit of a cool off in the afternoon as people head into work. And then by the late afternoon, this is a particularly hot day in June, by late afternoon, we're at about at 6 o'clock, we're at about 33, 34 gigawatts, not quite double what the nadir in the morning. And this is just in one day and declines from there. On the right is a plot of the daily peak load. So taking for each day this peak point and plotting it out, you can see from day to day, even within a season, the daily peak is higher and lower and higher and lower, and there's a sudden kind of a heat wave in April here. And this particular year, 22, at this point by the blue arrow, that is the peak demand load in history for California. 52 gigawatts approximately. So that was a big demand day. It was hot. All sorts of things just lined up for a very hot day. So you can imagine if you're the ISO trying to make markets, right? This peak day stands head and shoulders above even the next closest peak day, right? You've got to handle a lot more electricity than you do most of the time. So as demand moves around, the demand is inelastic. Most of us have never seen anything indicating what the current price of electricity is, and we certainly don't see it when we flip on a light switch or start an appliance that takes a lot of energy, an electric dryer or something like that, right? But these demand lines are moving around, and they have very little response because we have no real-time pricing. There's very few instances of this, right? No real-time pricing. Well, how do our utilities then set the price that they charge us? It has to come from somewhere. Well, essentially, they take kind of the year's average and they say, look, we had that big spike in September here at the blue arrow. We had that big spike, it cost a lot, so we need to pass that through in the average rate that people pay. And then they set our average rate based on that kind of year's worth of average. So people aren't responding to the peak. It just gets charged average, smooth out over the whole year on your per kilowatt charge. So there's very little incentive for people to respond. We've got inelastic demand, no response to price. We've got it moving around a whole bunch, and that can create problems. Now, in some places, there are options for real-time pricing. Texas has a number of retail utilities that you can sign up for that deliver electricity to you. A couple of them have variable rate contracts, so some people in Texas are on real-time pricing. And what happens is during really peak times like Winter Storm Uri in 2021, during the big freeze there, those people ended up with massive electricity bills. The price you can see over here on this bill, this is from filing for this gritty utility, is $3 a kilowatt hour. Now, Michigan has kind of average price electricity. We're 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So this is 20 times or more what we pay here in Michigan. And this poor person ended up with a bill of $11,069. So when you can't adjust or when you don't know the prices, having these variable rate prices can be really tough. So that's why we don't see a lot of response and demand. Another area in which this becomes the intermittent demand becomes a problem is in congestion. So the curve that I showed you before, a nice upward sloping curve, is kind of theoretical in that it's for one location, but electricity is actually priced in multiple locations. The wires that move electricity around have capacity constraints, and the laws of physics dictate that we can't kind of send electrons over this wire instead of that wire. Essentially, what happens when those wires reach capacity and risk thermal meltdown is that instead of operating the next generator up on that merit order curve, the operator has to turn on really expensive power plants that happen to be on the right side of the constraint. So this map here of California shows a day in 2022. It's relative prices, so the whites are the average price. Blue is up to $25 below average, and red is up to $25 above average. So the arbitrage opportunity here, if you could build a wire, would be absolutely huge between this red and this blue that are right up next to each other. But the wire between them is at capacity, so there's a very expensive generator somewhere over in red that is serving load there, while a very inexpensive generator in dark blue is not able to because of that wire. And in effect, this takes that curve and it makes it steeper. It makes it more steep, which drives prices up. So what's the solution? Peaker plants are dispatchable fossil fuel generation, almost always natural gas. And this is my favorite peaker plant in the whole wide world. This is the Delano Energy Center. This is in Central California, out in the middle of nowhere in farm fields. It's rarely ever run. So although it's economically efficient to have it on the grid in that sense, it is a very inefficient plant in that it takes a lot of energy per megawatt of electricity to generate. And my favorite fact about this is it ran so rarely. This is the month of July in 2016. This is a hot month. It ran about 15 hours total during the month of July. This is a hot month. and about 65 hours total in the entire year of 2016. And if you look at this plant, it does not look inexpensive to build. That's a large capital expense, right? But this is the plant that responds when you are way up at the top of that merit order, right? So it's also very dirty. You don't really invest in efficiency or pollution control if you're only operating 60 hours out of the year. So it's very dirty, and it's also very expensive to run, but it's very necessary for times when we hit those peak times, and that's why they're called peaker plants. So we have this kind of bad confluence of inelastic demand and intermittent demand. And we add in our second economic phenomenon, negative externalities, and these take the form of pollution. Right? So power generation is a major source of pollution. On the right here, you see a picture of Houston, Texas fairly recently. I grew up in Los Angeles. I can literally smell this picture. I know exactly what it smells like. There's myriad criteria pollutants that come from power generation: ozone, NOx, nitrous oxide, SOx, which is sulfur dioxide, particulate matter, very fine particulate matter. A lot of this goes together to form smog. And there are very real health costs that come with pollution. Heart conditions, emphysema, asthma, lower birth weight are all very well linked causally to increases in pollution. Right? So these are real costs. There's other economic costs. They're a nuisance. It's gross. It makes your eyes sting. It makes recreation much less fun. And those are all real things that people have willingness to pay to avoid. So in an economic sense, there's all these costs that are not being priced into power generation. Right? They're not being included in the price. They're being borne by people outside of the decision being made. And for a negative externality, right, a market failure is the category it falls in. We need policy, or we usually use policy to correct these externalities. And the first best policy would be to price the externality, right? A Pigouvian tax, for those of you that remember environmental economics, or cap and trade functions essentially the same. And this has the concept of polluter pays. The polluter has to pay equal to the marginal damage for an efficient tax. And it's hard to come up with that, right? If the wind shifts, the people who are being polluted, the other end of the smokestack, they change. And that might be a more vulnerable population. It might be more expensive. It might be fewer people. It may shift, the wind may shift from blowing offshore where there's nobody to onshore where there's lots of people. It's very hard to exactly price the externality. It's also politically difficult to do so, as the last 25 years has shown us. The second best policy option then is to subsidize or mandate clean energy, renewables. So since renewables have a $0 marginal cost, there is no cost for the fuel input to solar or wind. It's all a capital cost. Once it's built, all those renewables automatically go into the bottom end of our curve here. So down at the bottom, renewables go in there. They bid zero. They usually receive more than zero when the market price clears. So they're always first in the merit order, right? And they essentially shift the supply curve. So if you imagine that curve shifting to the right, to the left, to the right when you add renewables, right, where demand, the vertical line for demand crosses, that moves down in price, right? It crosses lower and lower in price, which is handy. But an issue with renewables, wind and solar, is sun sets, the wind stops blowing, and there's intermittency in generation. Right? So the plot here in the middle, the orange line is solar generation in California. This is 2024, and you can see the sun comes up and it goes up and the sun goes down. California doesn't have a whole lot of wind, but the capacity that it does have is a little bit negatively correlated, right? Especially in the evening here. You see it's a little bit higher once the sun has gone down. The wind kind of blows steadily offshore when the cooling of the land equilibrates with the cool ocean, so you get coastal breezes. And something's got to fill in there. This plot on the bottom is a plot of total demand. It's a green line on top, and then net demand, which is total demand minus that solar generation. So that wedge forms when the sun comes up and goes away when the sun goes down. Right? And that net demand in there is what has to be served by those fast ramping peaker plants or something that can be dispatched, that can be turned on. That leads us to this kind of phenomenon called the duck curve, for pictorial reasons here. So the duck curve is the net generation, net of solar, over time. And as time goes on, more and more solar capacity has come online. So this is the average for late March. In 2012, there wasn't a whole lot of solar, so it kind of has a nice flat day, which is great. 2013, 2014, 2015, as the years go on, that net generation in the middle of the day starts getting bigger and bigger, forming the belly of the duck. There's lower need for electricity in the middle of the day. Woohoo! That's nice, clean, renewable electricity. We get down to 2020, the belly of the duck is down at 12 gigawatts. At 2024 now, if you were to update this, that belly occasionally goes negative, meaning there are times in California where solar is serving, solar plus some other base load that can't be turned off, is serving essentially 100% of load. In fact, California is selling the solar electricity to other markets in the Northwest through transmission lines. And the problem the duck curve brings up is that ramp that happens in the evening, that big straight line going up right here, jumping up to this net demand, the head of the duck here, kind of late in the evening around 8 p.m. when solar is completely, the sun is completely set, solar is completely gone. That ramp is really hard to do. You need to marshal a lot of power plants that sit idly by most of the day and then ask them to turn on for a short period of time. By 10, 11 p.m., the head of the duck is passed and the day is essentially done, back to kind of base load and wind carrying things. So that's an expensive ramp, right? The expense is in how steep that ramp is. So we have demand moving around. So picture these vertical lines here moving around. We have renewables being inserted, shifting that curve to the right, right? And we have really expensive plants up there at the peak of the peak of the peak, where that blue arrow is pointing to. And in 2011, those tend to be oil burning plants. Now they're kind of expensive natural gas plants. And as renewables come on and go off throughout the day, the intermittency, that whole supply curve is shifting around as well. Right? So demand's moving, supply is moving, the intersection is fluctuating wildly up and down. This has some really important implications for how we interact with the grid, and this is where my research comes in. One question you might ask in light of this is, hey, okay, what if I put solar panels on my roof? Does that help? Well, a marginal addition of solar generation offsets some marginal responding plant. So the plant that's right on that line setting the market price, the plant that lives right here at 114 gigawatts of demand, that plant may be dirty, it may be clean, it may be expensive, it may be cheap, right? That's the sort of thing that we need to ask if, how dirty is it? What's the value of offsetting it based on your solar panels during times when your solar panels are generating? And that's going to vary by the season, by the time of day. So summer, right after sunset, it would be great if you could generate, but the sun is just set. Winter in the middle of the day, that might be a good contribution depending on what is on the margin. And that's something that isn't really obvious constantly. The other important facet of it is a location. So where you are in the country, where you are on the grid determines, and where you are in congestion pockets determines which plant is being offset. So if you're in one of those red congestion areas and you generate a little solar, you might be really helping out the grid and you might be offsetting a very dirty plant. So in 2023, I published a paper with some co-authors that thought, well, let's look at this for the whole country. Let's think about what happens if you put a solar panel in any zip code in the United States. And the first thing we have to do for this is to estimate the marginal responding plant kind of on average for every hour and every month in every region of the grid. We figure out which plants are responding, so which plants turn down when your solar panels come on and which plants turn up when they go away. And we calculate the dollar damages, the dollarized version of damages at each of those generators. If a generator is close to a population center, it might be very high. If it's far away from everything in a fairly clean plant, it might be low. We calculate the dollarized value. We add them all up across all generators for every possible place you could put a solar panel. And we put those on a map, basically. The plot on the bottom here shows kind of how that variation in pollution response. This isn't dollarized. This is just the nitrous oxide, and this is in Texas. Much of the year, throughout the day, the offset amount of nitrogen oxide is about constant. But here in June, July, and August, late in the evening, the offset amount is really big. It's about 3 times at its peak, the usual offset amount. So if you have solar panels that are producing in August at 4 or 5 p.m., those are going to be really helpful in reducing nitrogen oxides. So we add them all up and we make this kind of summary map of the total annual damages avoided per 4 kilowatt capacity solar installation. In the places you think there's a lot of solar, California, those numbers are kind of low, $200 per solar installation per year, which is not nothing, but it's not as much as you'd like it to be. Whereas in other parts of the country, these yellow areas, it's upwards of $1,000. So we find that actually the most efficient place to get solar on your roof is in Western Virginia here. And the reason that's so hot there, so good for the environment, is that it's offsetting plants that are dirty and are located close to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So we get interesting insights from the research. Another question you might ask is about batteries, right? If we put a big battery, that seems like it would be really good because it could store things. We could kind of flatten out that net demand. Batteries are fast ramping. They can charge and discharge on a moment's notice. They're clean if they charge from generation that's clean. They're not if they don't necessarily. So that remains to be seen. For those of you from Michigan or in Michigan or still connected to Michigan, we have kind of a traditional battery that's been around since I think the 60s or 70s. This is the Ludington Pumped Hydro Plant in Ludington, Michigan. This is the largest battery in the Western Hemisphere, 1.8 gigawatts, and it operates by taking excess electricity when it's cheap, pumping it uphill into this lake that sits on a bluff up above Lake Michigan. And when electricity is needed, it pumps it back downhill, running a turbine, kind of reversing the pump, runs a turbine and generates electricity. And this is a fabulous engineering marvel. I really love this thing. It's kind of cool to look at. When you drive by on the highway, you don't see much except kind of a grassy berm. But it's fun to know that the biggest battery, battery in air quotes traditional storage is here in Michigan. So some recent research that is in submission right now looks at what the price effect is of this energy storage. So this is about traditional batteries, the kind that are in those little semi-trucks. And my research finds that they do lower prices in kind of the second quarter, so spring into summer, in those late evening times when the head of the duck is prevalent. I see decreases of up to about 2% at the pricing location in which the battery is installed. Now, I also want to think about congestion. That's an important dimension. That affects prices altogether in an area. So I use a machine learning algorithm to identify which pricing areas are kind of linked together to ones that have batteries and account for those changes in prices in totaling up the kind of savings in the cost of serving load of a battery. And I find that kind of in the study window before 2020, ratepayers were only saving about half of the capital cost of the battery, with a little bit more going to the arbitrage opportunity of the battery operator. But once battery prices get a bit lower, about where they are today, the savings start to be about equal. So batteries are kind of justified on a ratepayer savings basis as of about this year. So the grid going forward is fun to think about. It's a great area for research that I'm happy to be in. Thinking about the grid of the future, we need to define best. Is a reliable grid best? Definitely a reliable grid. Is a cheap grid best? We definitely like it to be cheap. Is a clean grid the best? Well, we definitely like it to be clean. Economics is about trade-offs. So these three things, we kind of have to choose how much of each we want. Another interesting question is about new technologies for the future, where those fit in, bigger batteries or possible, new technologies and small modular nuclear reactors and things like that. So there's lots of open questions coming down the pipeline for the grid. And with that, thank you for joining me for your lunch. I'll turn it back over to Stephen here. And I think we'll get to take some questions.
Might want to stop sharing your screen, Justin.
I would like to, yes.
Everybody can see we were all prepared to talk with Katie.
My Zoom says I am not sharing the screen. If I hit
There
that,
you go.
there we go.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I really appreciate your thoughts on this today. The first question I'm going to go to from one of our responders is, you didn't say much about nuclear. One, where is nuclear showing up? And two, what do you think the prospects are for nuclear going forward?
Right. Yeah. Nuclear is kind of a hot button issue. It's a zero carbon source of energy. Zero carbon is rewarded fairly handsomely in most kind of schemes for how to get more renewables or zero carbon energy on the grid. So nuclear energy is located primarily the south, a bit in the west, and some in New England and the Midwest. And the thing about nuclear energy is it doesn't load follow very well. And it doesn't ramp up and down. It's incredibly expensive to turn it up and turn it down. It takes hours of planning. You can't just kind of put those rods in and out willy-nilly. Because of that, it makes it really difficult to incorporate in renewables or in any situation where you have kind of fast changing demand, which is exactly what we have. Right, so nuclear tends to count really well in what we call baseload. There's a certain amount of electricity that the grid always needs and is always on. And nuclear fills in nicely kind of down there where it'll always be operating. It's very low marginal cost. The fuel cost is fairly low. It's all in capital costs. It's more than renewables, but much less than natural gas. So as baseload, it has, you know, a very important role, but there's only so much it can do. Right? It can't do load following. It can't follow intermittent demand, much less, you know, intermittent net demand from renewables.
Questions are coming in quick now. Next question. One of our listeners was very interested to know that it sounds like battery technology is changing quickly, where I think it was 2020, where it was only recouping about half the cost of a battery. And you said this year their batteries are cost effective. What are the prospects for batteries over the next 10 years? Is this something the price is going to keep coming down, or are we hitting physical limits for battery storage? What are the prospects for battery to help us smooth the load?
Yeah, so as the cost keeps on declining, and batteries are an area where costs have continued to decline kind of exponentially. Solar and wind has stopped really the pitch of its decline in cost and kind of reaching a terminal state, but batteries don't seem to be slowing down in the reductions in cost. And part of that is the overlap between developing batteries for storage and developing batteries for other devices, for electric vehicles and those sorts of things. So we've only just begun to really work our way down battery cost curves. And there's all sorts of incentives aside from just the storage market for getting them down in price. I'm kind of excited about the future of kind of second life batteries, right? You picture a 10-year-old EV that's 60% of its range, you know, they wear out after a while. You can just take those batteries and kind of wire them all together with a good controller, and you can have a really inexpensive, decent capacity battery storage operation, kind of taking care of recycling those batteries. So as costs come down and the kind of threshold that I believe has been passed in the last 2 years or so is the capital cost of a battery is about equal to the savings to the ratepayer from having a battery on, right? It's going to shave off those peak prices. That's going to lower the inframarginal price, so the price of all the other electricity. And as we decline further and further in batteries, the private opportunity, right? That's independent from the fact that somebody operating a battery buys low and sells high, right? You charge it at night when it's cheap electricity. You sell it in the late afternoon when it's expensive electricity. Once we get to the point where that arbitrage opportunity is high enough, and the battery cost is low enough, then we could get to a situation where just the private profit maximizing incentive to arbitrage those prices is enough to get all the side effects, the lower prices for ratepayers at the same time. So there's kind of more to come as those prices decline, and a lot of promise in what to do in what they'll do. And they'll interact nicely with things like nuclear, right? You can use a battery to make nuclear essentially load following. Takes a lot of battery to do it, but that's kind of what that Ludington plant was built for. It was for the Palisades nuclear plant nearby, so they could pump up at night when nobody needed that nuclear power and discharge in the afternoon when we needed more than the nuclear plant could provide.
I want to stick with Ludington for a second. I moved here from California, and I knew there that they were doing a lot of this pumping as battery storage. I was not aware about Ludington doing the same thing. Is Ludington cost effective? Do we see things like Ludington other places, or how many Ludington type batteries are there?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. It was built so long ago, I think it's just hard to get an understanding of cost effectiveness. I think over its life, it certainly has been, in that it's just a long-lived asset. So I can't say for sure if it's cost effective. I think building another one like it today would probably be cost effective. Maybe there would be, it's possible that batteries might be a better use case, but again, in the 60s and 70s, that wasn't an option. The constraint on pumped hydro is that there's not all that many places where you have a lake on a bluff above another lake, right? So that's an unusual situation. And it also had an environmental cost. That lake existed, was marshlands before the 1960s. So you do lose some habitat. It's not pretty. They have been expanding the capacity of Ludington. They add another 3 or 4 feet. They gave it, I think, a 5 to 10% boost in its capacity. Just once it's there, you've already destroyed the lake that was there. Build it up a little bit higher to use it.
One of our listeners asked sort of if you could give a report card internationally, how does the US do? Is our average cost of production much better, much worse? If we were to think about cost of electricity across, is that the right way to rank countries and their electrical generation capacity about sort of average cost? And if it is, how does the US do?
Yeah, it's a fair way. You know, countries do have kind of natural strengths in ways they can generate electricity. We would lose out in comparison to like the Nordic countries because they just have geothermal springs with hot water that can turn turbines, and they drill a hole in the ground, put a pipe in it, and voila, electricity. So we definitely can't compete with Norway. But for what we have, you know, our markets do generally give us fairly cost-effective, very, very low cost, relatively speaking, electricity. And our integration of renewables, because we use these very flexible markets, has been fairly good and encouraging, right? Our market structures going to give the right incentives so that bigger picture, we're fairly efficient in how we manage our resources and operate our grid. There are steps we could take to make it much better. We could run more transmission lines so that low-cost electricity could be shared, could be exported to markets where it's more valuable rather than just kind of saturating. So if you're in northern Texas on a windy day, electricity is super duper inexpensive because there's just not enough wires heading out of northern Texas to get it to places that could use it. So it's kind of stuck serving you. So the more transmission we have, I think the better off we would be. And that's something that in the short run we can do that will also improve the long run.
We hear a lot about the electricity needs of AI, crypto, data center, stuff like that. Is that appreciably affecting our grid? And will we need to be making changes to the structure of the grid to accommodate those sort of technological changes?
Yeah, so the load of AI data centers, so these are largely kind of the places where there's hundreds and hundreds of thousands of very expensive chips that are training the multiple billions of parameters that go into, you know, a chat GPT type product. Those AI centers have huge draws. So if you look at the kind of increase in annual load over the last couple of years, you can visually see these data centers kind of eating up demand. The interesting part about them, though, is they're not all that intermittent, right? So it's a nice example of the shape of the load, or what we call the load profile, really determining its impact on the grid. All those processors are just pretty much always running. They're expensive. Once you have one, you want to turn it on and let it run for its lifetime. Any idle time doesn't save you any money, right? So these data centers tend to have very flat loads. And when you have flat loads, that really lends itself well to having something like nuclear serving you. So you essentially become part of base load, right? And you're not really part of the renewables problem. So you're always there. Something can always serve you. And that's why you see some data centers like Microsoft has entered a deal to start up one of the reactors at 3 Mile Island, which was the site of America's worst nuclear emergency, which was not, the Fukushima or Chernobyl level. So a lot of that demand is just opting to say, look, the grid's great, you have fun with it. I'm just going to make a baseload generator over here and take care of myself, and you just kind of cut me out of the loop. Right, so that's kind of where AI data centers go. Once you've done that, right, there is a little bit of opportunity on the peakiest of peak days, right? That very tippy top. It might be financially feasible to turn down some of your NVIDIA GPU chips that you're using to train your model and lend a little bit of that electricity back to the grid. So there is thinking along those lines that, some of these AI data centers might be able to, in an emergency, turn down a little bit and provide us with a little bit of peak shaving, just the most expensive part. Take an afternoon off, let that electricity power the air conditioners at the local load center, and then come nightfall, turn them back on, and we won't ask anything of you for a year, basically. And that can all be done with markets, just by pricing the electricity high enough.
In the news, we've heard concerns about an aging infrastructure, increasing load demands. So a little bit ago, I asked you to give us a grade on international comparisons to average price. How about give us a grade of where we are in having this very important infrastructure in good shape? Are we facing crises in the structure of our grid?
We are, I'm not going to say crisis, no, and I don't want to downplay the importance of investing in public goods like grids. We have some problems with getting enough transmission up and running because there's interesting incentives for some to not have transmission. But in general, we have a system that's very robust. We're good at finding ways to make money, and our grid is operated such that things that you do can make you a lot of money for moving electricity around and for serving load when it needs to be served, right? So we kind of have the setting in place to take care of increases in load demand. And it's something that occurs not without effort, but within the management kind of methods that we have for the grid.
So this question's obviously coming from me. My very first job as an economist was at a nuclear power company in Nebraska. And what I was doing was load management, working with center pivot irrigations and turning those on and turning those off. I now see my father-in-law, who has Tesla, that being charged at particular times with. So, so what I did back in 1991 is now being done in my father-in-law's house right now down in Tampa. I don't know the price of my electricity, never have. I get it that if I did, I'd probably be in trouble. What about these sort of technology that we're starting to see in homes, say when we charge cars? Are there other things that we could do that you expect to happen at the consumer level to help with load management? Or is the future of load management all these really big batteries that you were showing these pictures of?
Yeah, this is a great question. Essentially, kind of new technologies like being able to set time for charging on an EV, or a lot of people have programs now where they can sign up with their utility. They put a little transponder on like their heater or air conditioner, and they can control. The power company can turn your air conditioner down or up or whichever way you think of it to use less electricity on a peak demand day. And all those technologies are really neat in that they essentially put some slope in that inelastic demand. We start to see, well, at some price, yeah, we can turn down demand. The reason we never had elastic demand in the past is that it was just too hard to communicate what was going on and get people to respond. So automated technology, especially, we kind of have good research that shows, people need to know about the prices, and it kind of needs to automatically happen for them. People are not very good at checking hour by hour and turning up and down based on, oh, it's 40 cents a kilowatt hour. Turn down that air conditioner, 50 cents a kilowatt hour. Unplug the refrigerator. Right? That doesn't work. So these new technologies let people respond. A lot of them are in the form of time of use pricing, right? Which is not real time pricing. It's just it's more expensive at times when usually the real time is more expensive. And that's enough to get people to kind of set timers and to use automation. So Michigan, we have like a half a cent a kilowatt hour is the price difference between on peak and off peak. It's silly that we even have it. It's so small. But if it got larger and larger, right, people who have the ability to automate could do more and more to adjust, to charge at different times, or set their Nest thermostat to heat and cool differently. So it's a neat way of getting some slope in that demand, returning some elasticity to consumer demand, and something that's very promising in the future. So batteries for what can't be changed, and some demand response for homeowners and commercial users for things that can. It's a good combination.
The next question, I'll tell you that my personal connection to it. My daughter flew to Miami to see Taylor Swift. Taylor Swift was in the news this week for her jet, and then claims about whether or not it was net zero carbon. And one of our listeners today wanted to know, what does this net zero carbon mean for somebody? Like, how is that factored in? For a company that wishes to be net zero carbon, what does that mean?
Yeah, there's really two forms, and the older form was basically the best we could do essentially at the time. The older form of a company saying they're net zero carbon would be they just use electricity as they usually would, and then they find a way, they pay for renewables to generate that exact same amount of electricity, right? Well, at times when the company is using energy, but the wind farm that they bought isn't blowing, isn't operating because there's no wind, well, they're putting carbon out into the atmosphere. And it might be that in times when they are generating and their company subsidized, this is our Google wind turbine farm right here. When it is generating, it's not necessarily maybe offsetting a lot of carbon. Right? So it might be offsetting other renewables even. So when you aggregate to the year, you kind of wash out a lot of emissions. A newer form of net zero is just kind of like zero all the time. And that's really what people have in mind, I think, when somebody says, oh, we're zero carbon. What they're really thinking is, we have not increased carbon emissions through our operations in any way, right? And that is moment to moment. Every bit of electricity they need, they are generating themselves through a zero carbon source, right? So the data center example, if they operate their own nuclear power plant and it just is plugged straight in and there's no other draws anywhere, that's going to be like a true zero carbon operation. And we're only now getting into kind of the territory of renewables where it's feasible to actually claim that you're doing something like that.
And I have several questions here about peaker plants. I think a lot of people are interested that these peaker plants might only be on 60 hours a year, I believe you said.
For that one, yeah.
Yeah, peaker plants, those will always must be natural gas, or
Yeah, they essentially are almost always natural gas. There's two types of natural gas, so they're going to be the less efficient but easier ramping kind. Coal does not load follow very well. It's very slow in heating up and cooling down, faster than nuclear, nowhere near as fast as natural gas. And natural gas is nowhere near as responsive as like a battery storage operation would be.
I'm going to back up a little bit. What first got you interested in the grid?
Oh, I started out actually working in offshore wind in the fisheries. So I was an economist with the National Marine Fisheries Service before I did my PhD. And I was tasked with writing a report on the response of the fisheries to offshore wind. So essentially, we want to put some offshore wind turbines here, may or may not kind of close the ocean to fishing for safety reasons. They wouldn't officially close it, but you can't really fish too close to a big post in the water. And in going out and speaking with fishermen about it, they were really interested in like, well, what's this going to do to our electricity prices? They were almost equally worried about their home electricity prices as they were to having wind turbines in the fishing grounds that they've fished for their entire career, that their father and grandfather fished. And I thought, that's really interesting because I don't know the answer to that, and it's a really interesting question. So that kind of brought me into the grid operation. We don't see those wholesale prices at all. We don't think about it when we turn on the light, but they're important economic influences that are just kind of lost to us, important signals. So those two things combined, being interested in how households make decisions about energy when they don't really even have the prices with which they could make those decisions, and concern about kind of how does all this affect the wholesale grid, the big things behind our electricity bills.
Now, to back up a little bit further, what got you into economics in the first place? Were you a 8-year-old studying lemonade stands that other kids were creating? And I'll give you a bonus if you can use the word keytar in your answer.
Keytar, let me see if I can do that. So I got into economics. I come from a different side as I started in land use planning and environmental impact reporting. I wasn't so much big on the numbers. I wasn't an econ major as an undergraduate. I studied city planning. I wanted to play SimCity for a living, which is, it's hard economic, but also, I thought, oh, nature needs to be saved. And eventually kind of learned in doing land use planning 2 important things. Number one, a lot of things that look pro-environmental are actually extremely expensive and not as pro-environment. There was an open space near my house growing up that was part of a golf course, and they tore it down to build houses. And I thought, no, you shouldn't, it's open. And then you dig in a little bit further and you find out that, golf courses aren't natural habitat. Housing density is important. And the other thing I learned in doing that is that when you put numbers to things, people listen. So being able to understand things quantified was super important to kind of realizing if you want to communicate something, you need numbers to it. And if there's a dollar sign attached to it, that's even better. So that's what kind of brought me into economics as a tool instead of kind of being an economist and needing to find a place to apply myself. None of this lets me segue into my 10 years in a rock and roll band that I spent as a land use planner on the side. So I was a touring musician for a number of years, 5 to 10 years, saw the country with my friends, played the keytar during that time, and then just kind of decided there was a different calling in life for me.
I'm going to segue back to one question that just came in that yeah. How concerned should we be about terrorism attacking our grid?
Ooh. Yeah, this is interesting. A nice feature of renewables is that they are distributed. You could take out a couple turbines and, that would be bad, but you're not going to shut down the entire grid. Taking out transmission could be a different problem, right? The response to that has to be pretty fast. So there are a number of contingencies. So grid planners kind of have an n minus k contingencies. They have some number where every link of the grid is analyzed so that you could have up to some number of kind of destructions in the grid. So a grid will be resilient up to maybe 3 or 4 different parts of it being taken out. And anything beyond that is just, we can't plan for that. We can't have every line be completely redundant. So there is like a serious threat of terrorism. You need to know a lot of information to actually do it in a way that would cause a lasting outage, like a real blackout, not just knocking out power for some people, but needing to restart the entire grid from scratch. But it is, a real issue. You can do long and lasting damage if you know exactly where to go. So it is a significant concern. It's a concern that's very, very well known in the communities that should be watching our grid for these sorts of things. So it's it's not necessarily a worry for me because people that know what they're doing and are serious are on it.
Final question. You're now in your 6th year here at MSU. What aspects of MSU and MSU Economics do you most appreciate?
Oh, wow. Every time I walk in the morning, I appreciate the heat in this building. The collaboration and the interaction with the rest of the faculty. This is the only department I've ever been in, but knowing what I know about kind of other places and how they operate, it's very hard to have a congenial and productive faculty all working together. And MSU has something very special in our faculty that helps us as juniors, as junior faculty, really feel comfortable, be able to reach out with questions, get input, be mentored, and work kind of in our field with people around us closely. And that's something that I think is special to here and is not recreated in a lot of other places. So something I really appreciate here.
Great. Thank you, Justin. Unfortunately, our time has come to a close. Thank you. Goes back to my first job. I probably more excited about the grid than most people out there, and this was just great to learn about. I look forward to reading your continued research about electricity in the United States. I do want to give a quick thank you to Katie Fry and Tammy Muthil for helping make the webinar happen, putting together the invites, and creating the webinar itself. Finally, and most importantly, I want to thank you, our alumni. The Department of Economics is what it is today because of the reputation that you have built based on your many successes and your generosity. Generous alum provide funding for a host of programming at the undergraduate and graduate level, as well as creating chairs and professorships. In addition, generous alumni have given back with their time and expertise, serving on panels and providing internship opportunities to our undergrads. Please contact me if you'd like to find ways you can give back. With that, that's all we have today. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Justin. And with that, I'll say go green.